Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. How are you?
I'm doing well,
Good.
thank you.
Good.
And want to talk a little bit today about what's going on in Yemen. We haven't mentioned that too much recently, and evidently there's some news out about that.
Yeah.
But before we get into that, I want to do a little update from yesterday, because we were talking about sanctions on Iran, but the president's not backing down, and that's one place I don't expect him to back down. But the fireworks are still there, at least the verbal fireworks. I'm impressed that it hasn't caused more disruption in the markets. The markets just seem to be oblivious to this, and it seems to me like the war is the trade war is building, and the sanctions, and people are getting angry, and Trump is very angry today. I want to mention that. And yet the stocks are doing great, and people aren't worried. And so I'm trying to analyze it psychologically. Why aren't they a little bit nervous about this? Because, no matter what's happening for today, I'm still convinced that sanctions and trade wars aren't good. And already we see signs of currency wars. And someday it may even advance. But I do want to talk a little bit about that, because Trump had a pretty strong statement today. He's not backing down. Don't mess with him. If you trade with Iran, we Americans are not going to deal with you. We're going to excommunicate you from the financial services of the world forever. So they better toe the line. Yesterday we talked about it, and you were sort of the idea that just for practical reasons, they may test what's happening, but for practical reasons, they might, the Europeans might not want to defy what the president is saying. So the president has come back. You're toying with these ideas of getting around it, but if you do, but who's he talking about? He's talking about China, India, Russia, Turkey, and all these things. We're going to crack down. So maybe the conflict in trade may eventually evolve into people getting nervous in the market. But right now, there doesn't seem to be much nervousness in the market as a result of this trade war that's brewing.
And it makes you wonder if maybe the markets just don't believe his tweets. They don't believe him, which I think can be dangerous, because he likes to bluster, and it doesn't really follow. He blusters against Kim, and then they meet. But what if he is serious once? We do have the tweet that you're referring to that the president put out this morning very early. The Iran sanctions have officially been cast. These are the most biting sanctions ever imposed. And in November, they ratchet up to yet another level. Anyone doing business with Iran will not be doing business with the United States. I'm asking for world peace, nothing less. That seems a little scattered. I mean, sanctions, peace.
Peace on his terms. And I recall so often hearing during the Cold War, really, if you understood what the Soviets were all about, the Soviets wanted peace too, but it was always on their terms. So we're all for peace, but the terms are spelled out here, and the terms are being challenged. We set the standard because we're the most powerful nation. We have the most powerful army. We have the reserve currency, and we still have a lot of wealth, and we control the financial market. So we have a lot of clout. But there is a time when the antagonism will get so great. How will if these countries do go ahead and defy them? Because China is perfectly capable of doing trade with Iran.
And they said they will.
Yeah, and they will. And we do a little bit of trading with China, and that's that thing going back and forth with all the sanctions. You put these sanctions on, we'll put on others, and it acts like what you suggest. Nobody really believes it's going to hurt anybody, but the history shows that tariffs like this do hurt. Their individuals are hurt. Small businesses are hurt that don't have a voice, and also sometimes it takes a little while. But it was claimed that in the 1930s, when Hawley-Smoot was passed, that just the passage of the bill in the Senate was enough to crash the market real quick. It didn't wait for the effects, and it didn't wait for them to be put into effect. And it seemed like the knowledge was that it would be bad. It doesn't seem to be apparent today. So we'll have to wait and see just what pans out on this little squabble.
Yeah, interesting.
So I do want to talk about Yemen. We've talked about Yemen before. Al-Qaeda is there, and they've been up and down. But all of a sudden, a few years ago, it must be 6 years ago, that the Saudi Arabia got involved. They've always been involved with Yemen, so good piece of property for them. But there was revolutions going on, and then the Houthis didn't like the leader they had, the Hadi, and they sort of ran him out of town. So they've been fighting, but Al-Qaeda got involved. And, Al-Qaeda, we don't like Al-Qaeda. We went in and we looked for Al-Qaeda, in Syria, so we have to go after those guys. Those are the bad guys. So we get involved. But guess what? There was a report from AP, and AP is not lumped. I don't think Trump calls them fake news. Here they reported that Al-Qaeda and the U.S. have collaborated on fighting the Houthis. So that's interesting information, not only because we sort of knew that, but we sort of never expected it to be put out in mainstream media because for some reason that's supposed to be that's top secret stuff. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there.
Yeah, and we came by this by Zero Hedge, which we often browse, and they pointed out, and it is a blockbuster. It's not because it struck us by surprise, because you've been saying it for a while. A lot of people have been saying it for a while, and of course just brushed off conspiracy stuff. But AP is really, if you talk about the mainstream media establishment, it's the mainstream media establishment, especially when it comes to foreign affairs. And if you read the AP, it's an investigation that they did. It's not some guy opining. It's an investigation they did. They went on the ground. They talked to people on the ground, and they found out that the U.S. in coalition with the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, is not only not attacking al-Qaeda as they claim, but actually giving them safe passage, actually giving them money. The AP mentioned one Yemen commander who was put on the U.S. terrorist list was given a bunch of money by the United Arab Emirates. Another terrorist al-Qaeda member was given $15 million by United Arab Emirates. They're hiring these al-Qaeda militias because they say the real enemy are the Houthis.
Nobody should be surprised. This is our tradition. We've been involved all the way back in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen and dealing with bin Laden, But he was on our side because he would fight the Soviets and want to get rid of the Russians out of Afghanistan. So we were involved and aligned ourselves in different ways. And that has happened ever since. I mean, it's happened, in Syria. Actually, U.S. and al-Qaeda essentially have lost the war in Syria, and the Russians and Assad has won. And yet we were closely aligned, but nobody really talks about it. Nobody ever said this about the coalition in Syria, like they're mentioning here that they could be working together. But that's more or less what is expected. But I think it's a bad alliance, But there were those who defend these alliances because it's the results that counts, And they say, well, yeah, we'll do it. We'll get rid of the al-Qaeda after al-Qaeda defeats Assad, then we'll get rid of al-Qaeda, that sort of thing. But sometimes it doesn't go exactly how they planned.
And actually, at one time at least, the U.S. government did admit that, and this was the Syria similarities. The State Department spokesman at the time, he admitted, under Obama, admitted that it's very difficult to disentangle our moderate rebels with al-Qaeda, with al-Nusra in Syria. So we had admitted it a couple of times. But we have a quote up here, and this is from the AP report. They're quoting a Middle East analyst from the Jamestown Foundation, which is a very well-respected group. And this is really fascinating if you read about this and just sort of digest it. He said, this is Michael Horton, a fellow at the Jamestown Foundation, very mainstream Washington outfit. Elements of the U.S. military are clearly aware that much of what the U.S. is doing in Yemen is aiding al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula, and there is much angst about that, he said. However, and this is the key sentence, supporting the United Arab Emirates and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia against what the U.S. views as Iranian expansionism takes priority over battling al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula and even stabilizing Yemen, he added. And he went on to say that the U.S. war against al-Qaeda in Yemen, quote, is a farce.
Yeah, and of course, that's their big excuse, is that Houthis are 100% controlled by and they work for the Iranians, and that's that's why they're justifiable. And I'm sure they're very sympathetic, and what they do is not quite as ruthless as what the Saudis are doing. I mean, the Saudis are rather ruthless about how the Houthis have been treated, and it's been going on. There's starvation going on there, totally ignored really by the so-called international do-gooders who say, well, why is not the UN in there feeding these people? Or I thought the UN was a peace organization, but nothing seems to happen. And yet the real message that needs to get out is the type of people that we align ourselves with. And you may come up and say, well, in war you have to do that. We align ourselves with communists when we were fighting Nazism and all this. But that's all a secondary consequence to bad policy. We get sucked into this stuff. We start and we support one group, and then we do all kinds of things that makes no sense whatsoever. And this is what someday we have to wake up and say, it's better to not get engaged in all of this rather than sorting out pros and cons. Or, well, we should help this al-Qaeda group, but not this al-Qaeda group. We should help this company. And then they justify, super support for Saudi Arabia. At the same time, they have questionable policies. And then, the Iranians, less than perfect as we are, all of a sudden becomes the monsters, and they go after Iran. That's the part that we ought to draw the lines differently. Instead of saying, well, if we can only have this victory and get the Saudi Houthis, and the person they support, back in controlling, Yemen, everybody's going to be happy.
The quote and what you're saying here, it just reflects on Washington's obsession with Iran. We're willing to give a pass to al-Qaeda because we're so obsessed with this imaginary Iranian expansionism. Where are they expanding to? No one can point it out. They're so obsessed, and part of this has to do with how foreign powers drive Washington's foreign policy. And if you look at our policy toward Iran is driven by the Israelis, the Saudis, and the United Arab Emirates. We're not pursuing the U.S. interests, we're pursuing their interests. They're so deeply ingrained. In fact, I was going to bring up the United Arab Emirates were singled out in the AP report for giving millions of dollars to al-Qaeda in Yemen. But what else does the United Arab Emirates fund? Well, they fund a lot of think tanks in Washington. That might tell you why our policy is so hawkish toward Iran. They're the biggest funder to the Atlantic Council. We give them over $1 million. We've talked about that before too. The Middle East Institute, they gave $20 million in 2016 to the Middle East Institute. And they gave millions to Brookings. So you look across the spectrum, the political spectrum in Washington, every single think tank is rabidly anti-Iran. And then you scratch a little bit and see where the money comes from.
You mentioned the three countries that we align ourselves with that have a lot to say about our foreign policy, but it's really brought together, and you pointed out so clearly that it's this neocon movement and these think tanks that are financed, by government agencies of government. They're the ones who bring all this together. Sometimes you wonder, did it all start in the United States and we went out and found these people, or did these other people just find us and take advantage? Probably a little bit of each, but there's certainly people who don't believe in the sovereignty of our country like we do, where we should mind our own business and stay out of the affairs and don't dictate to other people what to do. Instead, here we, in the midst of all this, military intervention, now we have economic intervention with the sanctions. At the same time, this is morphing over into currency battles as well. So yes, it looks pretty good today on the surface. Unemployment's way down, and people don't seem to be very happy about all this. So there's a little bit of fiction, I guess, in our reports. But I don't think people in this country are unhappy like they were in the 1960s. In the 60s, they were unhappy because they were sick and tired of the war. The Vietnam War. People aren't sick here and having this conflict here. The conflict here is a result of something else going on, and I think that has to do with the cultural Marxists and people who have, invaded our universities, and it's cultural and it's philosophic, where the American people generally ignore all this. I mean, if anybody say they're a terrorist, you can do anything you want. Oh, just take care of the terrorists, make me safe, so I can go to college and study under the Marxists, and bring about socialism. That's what they're thinking about more than what I believe they should be.
And I think it's better hidden now. You don't see it like you did in the Vietnam War, and so they're wondering why is my job so junky and I can't afford anything. They don't realize this is part of it. But I would just say that you talk about how that we believe we can take al-Qaeda versus Assad and then take care of them later. This is the whole worldview of the geostrategists, of the people that believe it's a big chessboard and we can move things around as we wish. These are the people who get us into so much trouble with their mischief, and they run Washington. So I would just end by saying I'm sure a few of our viewers have seen a little bit of a controversy about some people being suspended from Twitter, Peter Van Buren and yours truly as well. We're going to do a special segment of the show later today, probably at 2:30 Eastern Time, where we'll discuss some of these issues with Peter and with Scott Horton, who was also dismissed from Twitter. Dr. Paul, I know you're interested in your poor servant being kicked off so brutally, but we'll discuss it later.
Is that a badge of honor or what?
I don't know. It's a strange thing, but we'll delve into it a little bit. First time the three of us are together talking about it.
Well, very good. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people interested in that. But once again, I think that the problems we have talked about, whether it's the trade sanctions, the mess that's going on with Iran, and here we talked about Iran strictly with sanctions and trade, and yet we go and we say we were going to talk about Yemen, but guess what? We started talking about Yemen, then we also had to talk a little bit about Iran, for Iran being blamed for all the problems there in comparison. So I think the case is easily made from looking at world affairs and looking at our financial situation and all that's going on, that a pretty good case is being made, not only by us, but by just common sense of what's happening in the world, and a little look at history and look at economic policy, that there's a lot to be said about non-intervention. Mind their own business. Let's talk about personal liberty. Let's put confidence in individuals making their own decisions on how they want to run their lives and how they should be able to spend their money. I mean, it's not that complex. Right now, what we're seeing and the mess that we're in, whether it's international or domestic, is the failure of government. And a lot of people would like to say it's the failure of too much liberty, the failure of capitalism. No, that's not the case. It's the failure of government, bureaucracy, and intervention, and inflationism, the Federal Reserve, taxation, and total control, and brainwashing in our university. That's where our problems are. Yes, we would have some of those problems in a free society, but believe me, they would be greatly reduced. The people who believe that way and messed up, they would suffer the consequence. But now, today, when they get in government and they mess it up for all of us. And it becomes international. And that's why I do believe we face some serious crises ahead. And hopefully people will wake up and look to the ideas of liberty, because that is where I believe we can find our answers. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.